Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the seminar series on forced migration. I'm Aisha Chalar. I'm a professor of social and cultural anthropology at University of Vienna and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, IWM. This seminar series is part of Europe-Asia Research Platform on Forced Migration at the IWM Vienna and Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group in Calcutta, and is hosted at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Vienna. Our inaugural seminar was in November 2020. Europe-Asia Research Platform on Forced Migration advances the cooperation between European and South Asian institutions and scholars, while building a joint research platform for innovative knowledge production on forced migration and border regimes. Bringing together scholars, policymakers, and practitioners, hopefully from different disciplines and regions, the seminar series aspires to decentering scholarship, especially Europe-based scholarship, Euro-focused scholarship, debates, and policies on forced migration. The 2020-2021 talks focus on refugees and migrants as social, cultural, economic, and political actors. Various topics will be discussed, including changing regimes and forms of governance of migrants, refugees, the solidarity networks, and demands for social justice as entangled with increasing inequalities and austerity politics and racism, the institutional components regulating and managing different forms of displacement, as well as incorporation and exclusion of refugees and migrants from labor markets and protection regimes along the lines of gender, race, religion, and work. The seminar series on forced migration team members, apart from myself, are Anna Chukovic, coordinator at the research of the research platform at University of Vienna, and Clemens Schmidt, who provides us valuable technical assistance. Without both of them, I think we could not have managed this. I would like to introduce today's speaker, Jennifer Hyndman. Jennifer Hyndman is a professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University, Toronto, where she was also the director of the Center for Refugee Studies until 2019. She is a geographer by training. Hyndman's research explores political, economic, cultural, and feminist dimensions of migration, focusing on people's mobility, displacement, and security. Her scholarship is particularly concerned with the dynamics of conflict and disaster that create refugees and internally displaced persons, as well as international humanitarian responses to such crises. Hyndman's numerous projects examine, among others, the intersection of conflict with the 2004 tsunami in Sri Lanka and Aceh, Indonesia, as well as the geopolitics of international aid in these locations. Her work also includes geographies of refugee settlement, exclusion, containment, and the production of securitized spaces, both in the global south and in North America. Hyndman's current research projects probe the private refugee sponsorship in Canadian communities over time, which is related to the topic of her talk today, and the social determinants of well-being and integration of Syrians who came after November 2015. Her research exploring private refugee sponsorship is funded by the SSHRC Canada. Hyndman is also an author of numerous books, including Refugees in Extended Exile, Living on the Edge, with Venona Gillis, dual disasters, humanitarian aid after the 2004 tsunami, and managing displacement, 2000, the 2000 book, Managing Displacement. She has also published numerous articles, just to give a kind of an taste of those articles that I will give a couple of titles. Mind the Gap, Bridging Feminist and Political Geography Through Geopolitics. Waiting for What? The Feminization of Asylum in Protracted Situations, with Venona Gillis, and The Geopolitics of Migration and Mobility in 2012. Hyndman has also written, in addition to those to her scholarship, also written policy reports for Citizenship and Immigration Canada, UNHCR, Metropolis, British Columbia, UNICEF, and others. She also acted as the co-director of Center of Excellence for Research on Immigration and Integration in the Metropolis in Vancouver, as well as a field officer for the UNHCR in Somalia and a relief worker for CARE International in northern Kenya. As you see, that her scholarship, research, experience cover and reach out various continents and crosses global south, global north. We are very pleased and honored to have you as our speaker today, Professor Hyndman. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It is a very generous one and a very generous introduction. Thank you, Professor Ayşe Kagler. It's really a pleasure to speak to people. Let me just say good afternoon to those of you in Vienna or Europe. Good evening to those of you in Calcutta or beyond. And good morning to those of you here in North America. It really is a treat to be here and to present research that has not really been presented in any depth yet. So it is going to be one of those experiments, and I hope you'll join me in the adventure that might entail. But I want to thank too Anna Chukovic for her help in setting this up, and Clemens Schmidt as well, because without their role in this, we wouldn't be here. So I also want to mention and shout out to my research team who helped pull together some slides that I'm going to pull up right now. Wouldn't you know that you're just looking for there we are. You're looking for your PowerPoint right at the moment where it doesn't seem obvious. So I'll introduce the research team in more detail, but they not only helped with conducting some of the research, but they helped pull this slide deck together. So without further ado, let me just say, will civil society keep stepping up? That part of the title, I'm going to break down civil society and reduce it to a very small piece, essentially sponsors who are volunteers, who are part of civil society, who don't have to assist refugees with settlement, but decide to do so and actually put their own money on the table to make it happen. So I hope to answer that question by the end of this talk, but you will tell me if I don't, and hopefully there's lots of time in Q&A to discuss. The outline, first I'll just start off with what is private, also called community refugee sponsorship. Why should we care? Second point that I'll address is I want to show that the Canadian state depends on volunteers from civil society to support and fund refugee resettlement. They have done so for decades. And will they keep sponsoring? Will the sponsors keep sponsoring even as the state begins to push for more monitoring, more reporting requirements, and what I would call greater governance over this unique program? Then I want to drill down, if you like, and hear from sponsors, hear from former refugees, hear from the people who are doing this work. I am, after all, speaking to a professor, or have been invited by a professor in a department of social and cultural anthropology. And so I want to float the idea that sponsorship is not just a program. In fact, signs that it is something of a subculture, not to overuse the word culture, are clear through the research that we've done. So that'll be the third part of the talk. And then at the very end, I want to be a good geographer and link scales and argue that sponsorship, or observe perhaps that sponsorship is a global sense of responsibility that is enacted at a local scale, drawing on transnational networks. So I'll hope to illustrate that for you as we move forward. So in the Global Compact on Refugees, and I'll start broad and move down some of those scales that I mentioned. The Global Compact on Refugees calls upon states to explore complementary pathways to the three official durable solutions. And private sponsorship is one of those complementary pathways. So we know that the three durable solutions don't go far enough. And some of you may know, Joanna Reynolds and I have talked about the Global Compact on Refugees as improving the status quo, which is to say it probably doesn't go far enough. But what we want to look at is private sponsorship, which is mentioned and is often touted as something that could be replicated, as it is in the Global Compact. Can we really replicate private sponsorship if we don't fully understand what sustains it? Because this is driven by volunteers, people who are putting, as I say, their own money on the table, and to ask them to do it more than once or more than twice is really a tall order, in my view. And so let's move on. We know that the Canadian government has been considered more pro-refugee in the last 5 years. Just last week, we celebrated the 5-year anniversary of the first Syrians coming to Canada. The project that I want to talk about today, however, will be looking at this period prior to the exuberant arrival of so many Syrians who came. In the end, about 60,000 people have come from Syria since late 2015. This famous tweet from Justin Trudeau really comes out of the beginning of the Trump era, and you'll see it's dated January 2017. To those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. Thereafter, Canada was the receiving state of many people, as some of you may remember, who walked across the border and sought asylum in Canada and continued to do so, except during COVID. But what makes refugee sponsorship possible? Naomi Alboum is a key figure, both someone who worked as a civil servant, someone who is based at a university now, and who has been a sponsor herself. And she contends that there are specific ingredients that make sponsorship work. And again, I'll say more about what sponsorship is in a minute. But for Alboum, number one, you need political messaging like the tweet that you see in front of you. Political leadership is key to affirming refugee resettlement is a good idea, and asylum is an important protection pathway for people who are refugees. Second, you need civil servants that are ready with the appropriate policies and capacity to enact something like private sponsorship. In the case of the Syrians, the Syrian initiative was a major one. You need positive media messaging of this political leadership. And with that, you both get and produce, but public support is key. Without public support, no country can increase their refugee numbers, whether that be through resettlement or through other asylum programs. So it's a recipe on the one hand, but it's not something that you can simply order like you would off of a menu. You can't just order public support for refugees. As many of you in the countries that you're based in will know, Canada also faces pushback from civil society on this file. But that's another topic that we can perhaps address in the discussion. So what is the private sponsorship of refugees program? For 40 years, since 1979, a civil society-driven partnership with governments has enabled the additional refugee resettlement of privately sponsored refugees in Canada. When I say additional, I mean here that this is on top of what commitment the government of Canada has made. So there is this principle of additionality that really was formative when private sponsorship began. In these last 4 decades, over 327,000 people have been privately sponsored from more than 175 countries, and they've settled across Canada in more than 160 Canadian cities. Now, again, I'm not looking at the so much the Syrian moment of resettlement, but private sponsorship during that period suggests that more than 300 towns, very kind of remote areas, some were islands, in fact, off of the west coast of Canada, received refugees. So basically, refugees go, when they're privately sponsored, to where the sponsors live. And that creates a geographic distribution driven by those people, the civil society segments on the ground that wish to form a sponsorship group. Why should we care about, some people might say, why should we care about resettled refugees at all? Because the numbers are small, and admittedly there are, but the quality of the protection space is the gold standard. It's the highest bar possible. People are given permanent residence with a chance to acquire Canadian citizenship within 5 years. And one reason we also need to look at private sponsorship is this is a category, which we'll see in this table, that has grown exponentially very quickly. If we look back and reflect 10 years ago on GARs, are, I should have a legend here, a government assisted refugee. The number in 2010 was 7,500 people. That number was constant from 1994 to the mid 2010s. In 2010, we know that PSRs, privately sponsored refugees, were about 4,500. And if you fast forward 10 years later, we didn't reach this target in 2020 because of COVID, but the government assisted refugees have gone up, you know, in a very sort of positive fashion, about 35% to 10,100. But you look at the line for privately sponsored refugees and you see more than a 4-fold increase. So privately sponsored refugees are the largest group of resettled refugees in Canada today. We have a new category, BVORs. These are the blended visa office referred refugees. And I can speak about them. They're not central to the talk because this category was only invented in 2013. However, we can certainly discuss BVORs, not to be confused with the rodent that you find on Canadian money, which appears to be something of a national mascot. What does civil society do when they become sponsors? So what we have are groups of at least 5 people working together. They sign a contract, they have to have security checks, they become sponsors, and they basically undertake what Audrey Macklin and her research team have called active citizenship. And that is to say that citizenship is not just about having rights and getting to live in a particular country and be afforded certain safety nets and education and healthcare, but it also is about stepping up. So there are different formations of sponsorship groups, and sponsorship agreement holders is one of the most common, and it's essentially an umbrella group. It could be a large national church organization. It could be a faith group. It may well be a smaller community-based secular group that is geographically defined or located. It may have a number of different formations, but a sponsorship agreement holder is essentially an umbrella organization under which you have constituent groups of 5. You also have more autonomous groups of 5 that pop up and organize without any formal community link, but through a more spontaneous process of wanting to sponsor somebody. And I'll return to that point. There's also community sponsors, so community organizations become sponsors as well. And what do? They provide funds and social supports for 1 year. Now, technically it's 1 year, but as many of you can imagine, the actual, the arrival of new members of your community it's not a sort of a relationship that sort of expires after 1 year. But in that first year, startup costs are covered. Furniture and clothing might be donated, but there might be some cash provided to acquire whatever is needed. Basic necessities like housing, food, public transportation are also provided. And those who are sponsored become networked into local communities. There's a phrase that many are fond of, that people who are privately sponsored benefit from the social capital and the networks of their sponsors. Whether that be that the sponsor knows somebody who can put in a good word for them at a local business and perhaps help with a job application or something else. There is this notion of social capital, which I think is really interesting and not one I can explore here in much depth, but others have done so. And the main point here is that volunteers, rather than agencies, professionalized settlement agencies, provide social supports. So the next point I want to make is that for the longest time, and this is my sort of categorization that I'm going to provide in a moment, this program flew under the radar of government. It was, of course, enabled by government. In many cases, you could construe it as a public-private partnership because government had to screen for security purposes and health purposes. They had to select whether people met the criteria of being a refugee. All of that is sort of controlled by the federal government. But after the initial arrival of people from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in 1979, 1980, the connection to the federal government declined, I would argue, and we had what I call flying under the radar as a characterization of the private sponsorship of refugees program for about this 30-year period. Now, this is a generalization of sorts, so hopefully there aren't too many people from the federal government on the line who are going to take me to task on it, but I'm happy to back it up. The second period, which I would argue is about 2010 to 2016, is a reassertion of sovereignty by the government, not to take back this program, but to just get a little bit more oversight, governability, if that's a word. And although refused in 2000 and 2007, the federal government in 2010 and 2009, started in 2009, basically arriving at an agreement in principle by 2010 to create a national network of these SAHs, sponsorship agreement holders. So these are the sponsors. And in creating this national network, so too, I argue, was the private refugee sponsorship program more governable. And so this is an issue of governance that I'm not going to dwell on too much, but you'll see in a moment why it's important. This period also led to the invention of a new refugee category that I've mentioned, the BVOR. And some have argued that this is perhaps the beginning, and it's not a category that has been used that much, except during the Syrian initiative in Canada. But it speaks to a certain privatization of costs on the part of the government. And so sponsors have pushed back against this category in some respects. And I'm happy to talk about that, but again, not the focus of what I'm going to say. This period, however, gave rise to new caps and limits. And I think caps and limits are important. I'm gonna elaborate on what I mean by that. Basically, some restrictions were placed on the total number of privately sponsored refugees who could come to Canada, which did not exist before, and caps on particular visa posts. So I'll get to that in a moment. The third period, I'm calling a mandate shift. Basically, this is reasserting sovereignty with a new government in a new way, where you have a large number of people arriving during the Syrian initiative, and issues pop up that lead to calls for more monitoring of sponsorships, more reporting, and more assurance that refugees are being provided with the package that they've been promised, which is a modest package and needs to be delivered absolutely, because no one is going to get wealthy on the first year package of support. It is modest. But what I want to argue here is that sponsorship culture is shifting. And again, I'm playing a little bit on the anthropological host department invitation here, but I think that sponsors are autonomous in many ways because they know that they're doing work that the government could otherwise be doing. But they also are getting cold feet in a sense, and they're less likely to step up now than they were, let's say, 10 years ago. So I'll explore that a little bit as we go forward. Elsewhere, I've argued, and I've had the good opportunity to visit the University of Arizona almost 2 years ago, where I started thinking through and basically researching the banal bureaucracy, as I call it, of private sponsorship. And there's a lot to be learned. I'm going to I've got Radhika Mongia cited here and Etienne Balibar. And the reason that I've highlighted their work is they speak to and point to the ways in which race can be implied without actually mentioning it. And so let me show you how this happened. Uh-oh, come on. There we go. In the private sponsorship program. So first, let's take a look at the numbers. In 2016, sponsorship agreement holders were given a total of 10,500 spots to bring in refugees. And these were to be shared across different sponsorship agreement holders in Canada. Now, the vast majority of these spots, something like over 85%, were non-capped missions. But then this very curious sub-capped missions category was defined. And in fact, it was defined well before 2016. It's just that I caught on to it with this data in 2016. Only about 15% of that category of 10,500 or 1,650 persons could be brought in under these sub-capped missions. Now, where are these sub-capped missions? These are visa office missions. So these are basically where you'd find Canadian high commissions or embassies. Nairobi was allowed 400 people. And as many of you will know, Nairobi is a catchment area for refugees in the Great Lakes and region and the Horn of Africa. Some 20 countries send refugees to Kenya, Pretoria, of course, in South Africa, Cairo in Egypt, of course, many sub-Saharan Africans in Cairo, Islamabad, which I think is the outlier here geographically, Rome, where you have a number of people coming across the Mediterranean from Eritrea and other sub-Saharan African countries, but other nationalities as well. I don't want to overstate that. Tel Aviv, many of you will know that Tel Aviv, it's interesting that it has such a large number of, not such a large number, 350 people is not many, but Tel Aviv is also, the vast majority of that refugee population is from sub-Saharan African countries, notably Eritrea, some people from Sudan and Ethiopia. Dar es Salaam, again, another location in sub-Saharan Africa. So what I want you to do is think about that geography and think about how is it that, all but one of these visa posts serves mostly sub-Saharan African refugees, and yet it's being limited to just 15% of the privately sponsored spots that the sponsorship agreement holders are granted. So I write this up, and basically one of the outcomes of having these very tight numbers and lots of refugees, I should mention that during 2016, 35% of the global refugee population was based in sub-Saharan Africa. So to cap the numbers at just 15% of the total seems curious. And we could see this borne out in terms of the waiting times. I handed to the Canadian government that they put their waiting times. This is a dashboard that you can find online if you've applied to be an immigrant of any kind. You can find your refugee class here. And then if you're a privately sponsored refugee, you want to look at the wait times. For Kenya, the wait time in 2016, this was done in September of 2016, 70 months, which is a very long time. And that same day, I did a check. And again, we're in 2016 in the midst of the Syrian refugee initiative in Canada, bringing in many people. That same day, in September 2016, it was only 10 months to get to Canada as a privately sponsored refugee if you were coming out of Jordan. So that was a barometer of access, if you like. And that changed quickly. The Canadian government has retooled the lines, so they're much more equitable, I would argue, since that time. But nonetheless, administrative caps and limits generated a hierarchical geopolitical system of geographical preferences that were racialized. They weren't perhaps intended to be racialized, but certain groups of people in certain parts of the world, namely sub-Saharan Africa, were being excluded, or at least being given less access than other parts of the world. In 2016, Canada removed the caps, but they still kept the limits on overall numbers. In 2010, there was no formal limit on refugee sponsorship. It was a mix of what sponsorship applications could be processed by visa post officers abroad, and the readiness and the funding that sponsorship groups in Canada had. And so there was a more informal match between those two things. And so we can see that there are different periods of sponsorship that we can speak to here. Let me introduce the research team that has made the research that I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes possible. As Aisha kindly mentioned, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada has funded this. We have Joanna Reynolds, we have Biftu Youssef, we have Kathy Sherrill as a co-applicant and a leader on this grant as well. We have Dawit Demoz, and we have Anna Perky, all of whom have been extraordinary collaborators with me on this project. We're in the early stages still. As I said, this is really the first full-length presentation that I've done on behalf of the team. And we're just in the process of submitting a paper or two. So we're still early days. What did we do? 2017, I piloted a couple of interviews. We didn't actually start the full research until 2018. Since then, 100+ interviews and focus groups have taken place in 5 Canadian provinces, from large urban centers like Toronto to small, much more rural communities across the country. And so as geographers, we're interested in that rural-urban tension, or the secondary migration of people, but that's, again, another topic for another day. So total people interviewed or in focus groups was 108. 59 were sponsors, 35 were former refugees sponsored themselves, and 14 people were key informants. Who are the sponsors? We in this project are, as mentioned earlier, looking at the non-Syrian experience. We were looking at long-term sponsors who have a minimum of 5 years sponsorship experience. We started off with a minimum of 10 years, but we found that was a hard bar to recruit for. So we are looking for people who've done this for quite a while. And we're looking at, why they do it, obviously. So they may be civil society actors from faith groups, as I noted earlier. They might be from secular community-based groups, geographical communities that are committed to such volunteer work, who have a kind of global picture and a sense of human rights, humanitarian outreach, whatever it might be. But there are, as before, autonomous groups of 5 as well that basically organize around the knowledge that somebody is waiting and is in a precarious protection situation, or a precarious protracted refugee situation, and there's no good prospect of them getting out of that. Sponsors may have family, ethno-national community ties to those being sponsored, and I'll get into that in a moment. I don't want to overstate or create personalities too much in the notion of super sponsor, but there are community leaders, faith leaders, who really have done this work in ways that are remarkable. And I won't get into who those individuals are, but people have done this work for decades, and they lead the effort. I'm going to touch on some research that Audrey Macklin and her colleagues have done. One of the most interesting findings, when Audrey et al., and I'm one of the et als, one of the most interesting findings, and why did you undertake a sponsorship? A great number of people, a majority of people in one particular question said, well, I was asked to join a group. So often what it takes is one person, a catalyst, so to speak, who says, oh, Clemens, can you join our group? We'd really like to have you. And so this is an important piece of sponsorship that doesn't get a huge amount of airplay. Let me just, I got to move my gallery view there. I want to start in on some of the transcripts that we collected, and you'll hear from Tony here. Tony says, Lois kind of ropes you in and says, hey, I think you should do this. And we say, yeah, I guess we should. And so we do. Quite frankly, that's really what so much of it comes down to. People need to be networked, and there's somebody that has the energy to tie it together. All right. So then we go to how and why sponsors do this work, and they do it more than once. So sponsorship becomes, as we draft our first paper, a routine act, a practice that is part of a commitment to community and to others. In some cases, it becomes institutionalized or part of an ongoing network or structure. By that, I mean, I interviewed people or encountered focus group participants who had a refugee committee in their church. And that committee was a standing committee that was there every year, all year. Now, having said that, there was one particular focus group member who took it upon herself for her parish, her church, to be the lead for 25 years. So she could draw on that refugee committee, but there again was a strong kind of super sponsor individual who we call Colleen. As it turned out, I never interviewed Colleen, but she was a vital player that I'm happy to talk more about. These are pseudonyms, by the way, when I say Colleen. Sponsors voiced a generalized commitment to global human rights or social justice. When we ask people, why do you do this work? This is hard, intense volunteer work. This is not, well, I don't want to other any kind of volunteer work, but this can be a full-on job, as it was for Colleen, who would be picking people up at the airport in many respects, getting furniture for their homes so they had something when they first arrived, often on not very much notice. So there's an intensity to this type of work which is which should be recognized. But in a general way, global human rights, social justice came up often. Sponsors know or get to know many of the people facing precarious status as refugees through sponsorship. So sponsors from the faith-based organization, sponsors people who are sponsored, have family ties to those left behind, and or there may be somebody in the same ethno-national group as you, whom you never met, who is in prison and or being tortured for their human rights activism. So in terms of sponsor motivations, we're going back to Tony again. Yeah, social justice is a great catch-all. It's values, sort of ethics, basic social ethics. Sorry, I gotta move my screen again. Basic social ethics, responsibility. It's the right thing to do, so you do it. And Lucy says, also, I mean, how can I put it into words? A motivation now would be social justice, doing something that fits my reason, which my work does to a certain degree, but not entirely. Whereas with volunteer work, I can just do it. So speaking again to a project with Audrey Macklin, Lewin Goldring, Anna Korteweg, Shauna Labman, and many others, we pulled together and ran a survey, an online survey of sponsors. So this is not a representative sample, but we had more than 530 respondents, and we asked them, why did you sponsor? And now this, I should note, is for the Syrian sponsorship, where 80% of the people in this particular sample were first-time sponsors. So this is not the group that we're looking at in our work, but we do not have a comparable data set that we can speak to. So I just wanted to put this up here because I think it's really important. It's ethically the right thing to do was the most common response from people who were first-time sponsors or repeat sponsors. The death of Alan Kurdi was prominent, but not that important. You can see that for people who'd sponsored before, it wasn't that huge. It was 27% of sponsors, 40% of new sponsors. Past experience of sponsorship, obviously for those who'd done it before, they were ready to do it again. So that is another sort of piece of what motivates people. Kate, another person we identify as a super sponsor, affiliated with a faith-based organization. She says, I think that people who have faith in humanity, who are interested in human rights, who see it as a justice issue, are more apt to continue. And it doesn't matter whether the experience has been all warm, fuzzy, or difficult, or all of these things. But for people who see it in those terms, it's not something that you just do once and then go off and do something else. And we learn so much about resilience and about human nature. We learn so much about our own culture and how we complain about things that are inconsequential. Lorena says, so, you know, when you see and you're so deeply, deeply immersed on the raw edge of human suffering, and then I come back and I see my home with everything, every creature comfort that one could imagine, a life of privilege. I can do no less. It tells me that I have a great responsibility, a level of accountability that I need to rise to. And doing this work, it enriches my life. It gives meaning and purpose to my life and to who I am as a person. If I, in some small way, can enrich and bring meaning and purpose to the life of another person. Fikre says, you know, this guy, as I told you, we don't know him, but we felt his pain and we can just try to do something to help him. That's what we are doing. And Fikre came as a government-assisted refugee. Well, many years, more than a decade before he said this, he went from being a GAR, a government-assisted refugee, to a sponsor. And he does not know the person that he's sponsoring, but he does know that he has been tortured and imprisoned by government officials. So this person has now arrived in Canada, because at the time there was some question about whether he was going to actually be approved. Asha says, and the other reason for sponsoring is, since they grew up in a refugee camp, it's just to give them life, just to make them leave there, because there is nothing there for them. Asha is here in Canada and has sponsored her 2 nephews with assistance of a sponsorship group. And she houses them and she coaches them and she loves them as her family. They are, in fact, her nephews. So she's trying to help them out of the Dadaab camp situation. Kinship and family links also play a part. Aisha says this, I am originally from Iraq, and still there's a lot of tragedy there. I have a lot of family, a lot of people there, friends that talking to me and say, please, please save us. Please, if you can do something for us. I really feel so bad about them. I don't know how to help them. And one day I was so mad, so sad, I picked up the phone and I tried to look how to save them. Especially, I started with my family, which is my mom and dad, because they are still there and on the TV. And there's a lot of bombing and killing and. So Aisha was herself privately sponsored. She and her family came with one daughter who was a toddler at the time, and she had twins thereafter. But ultimately, at the time that I did this interview with her, she was not able to assist anyone. She was not connected to any private sponsorship groups at the time, even though she herself, as I said, was sponsored. I want to talk a little bit about the echo effect, because we just heard in that last quote that, you know, Aisha wanted to sponsor family members who were, she felt, imperiled by the conditions in which they lived. And echo effect refers to sponsorship of one group leading to a direct and subsequent sponsorship of additional family members, or perhaps ethno-national kin in the case of Fikre. So it's basically the idea that you bring in a group of people whose protection was imperiled, or was, you know, people who are at risk. They've got a safe place now, but their sister and her daughter are still, you know, in Beirut. And I'm not using the Syrian example, so I shouldn't use perhaps Beirut as an example, but they're still in Calcutta, or they're still in Nairobi. So let me just develop the echo effect idea a little bit more. Privately sponsored refugees in the Canadian context, again, the UK calls it community sponsorship, It's the only category, and Canada is different from the UK in this respect, the only category of resettled refugees we think in the world where sponsors, communities, and former refugees themselves can name specific persons. Now, they still must meet the refugee definition for resettlement to Canada, but private sponsorship allows for family-linked cases, or, for example, in the Eritrean community here in Toronto, there's a major push to, and not just Toronto, other parts of Canada, to bring in as many people as possible because the camp situations in which they find themselves are very precarious, and there is, in many people's minds, not much of a future with protection going forward. So the echo effect actually shapes sponsor motivations as well. Talia says, we also have a number of requests from community groups that were involved in government-sponsored refugees. Not actually the echo effects of PSR cases, but we are doing the echo effect sponsorship with them for them. It's a very confusing quote, but essentially it speaks to the fact that you bring in government-assisted refugees from, let's say, Eritrea, and yes, they actually have family members who are in those 4 camps in northern Tigray that were without food aid for 2 months. But so people are there, and they, you know, the sponsors come to know that people that are here in Canada have family in those camps and they want to help. So they get together and they do another sponsorship. And so there is a compelling reason, often a very urgent reason, to take on another sponsorship. Jessica says, I think that your passion has to be there, because if it's not, then you're not going to continue, right? But it's such a wonderful and rewarding experience that once you do a sponsorship, whether you're a sponsorship agreement holder or a constituent group, or it's a little bit of an addiction. You do it again because you meet some wonderful people, and you know it's just wonderful to see them flourish. Like they're so thrilled to be here and so happy for this opportunity that they'll do anything. I'm going to start crying. And they go out of their way to make something of themselves and to work for their families and take care of their loved ones. So when they do bring additional brothers or sisters or cousins, they're just so full of pride that they can do something to help them out or situations. So yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Community leaders are vital. Again, I've made this point earlier, but let's listen to what Tony says one more time. Sponsorship takes a political moment. It takes political leadership. But in the end, politicians follow. They don't lead. And there's some very unique ones, but most of them that look like they're leaders, they're really, you know, there's a movement that they've latched onto, and then they've been able to get in front of it. But those movements themselves are kept energized by some leadership that isn't necessarily that visible. I'm not an anti-politician because I know how important they are, and I sympathize with anybody that takes it on. But the way they're going to be successful is if there is some social movement of sorts that are behind them. So I think that's really interesting. We know that when the Canadian government was unwilling to take almost any Syrian refugees in early 2015, January 2015, a group in Toronto, Operation Lifeline Syria, just announced that it was going to, on its own, attempt to resettle 1,000 Syrians in 2 years. And that was an effort just in Toronto, Greater Toronto. And needless to say, they were ahead of the curve. It wasn't until the fall of 2015 when there was an election and political leaders were all promising to bring more Syrians than the other, that we actually had a commitment of any kind to Syrians who were basically off the table under the previous Canadian government. So, sponsorship, endurance, and fatigue. I think it's important. This all sounds like such a happy day for Canada, and I think there is a bit of smug Canadian nationalism sometimes that contextualizes or bookends discussions of sponsorship. But I think it's important to understand that sponsors get tired. They are volunteers after all. And when asked about The future of private sponsorship. Lois said, what about the future of private sponsorship for refugees program then? We're all tired. You go to those sponsorship agreement holder meetings, there's not anybody in the room that doesn't have gray hair, or they've dyed it if they don't. It's an older group, unless they're getting paid. The ones that are getting paid, they're happy, they're 30 or something. They are doing it as their day job. But the ones that are long, hardcore volunteers, I'd say are 60, generally speaking, 60 to 70. Again, that's Lois. And just to give you a sense of who's getting paid, sponsors themselves don't get paid, but some of the very large sponsorship agreement holders that bring in hundreds and hundreds of refugees per year, sometimes more than 1,000, some of these large scale SAs do have staff, so they are paid. Okay, we're almost done here. Local action, global impact. Sponsorship is an international resettlement pathway, complementary pathway, enabled by national government that has to allow refugees to be resettled and decide to do that. I think it's very important to remember that resettlement is completely discretionary. No government has to do it. National government lets people in. In Canada, it's supported by provinces who pay for healthcare and education at scales that are intensely local. Volunteers, including former refugees, engage in a transnational community practice in situ. So very local, but with transnational ties to those refugee camps in Eritrea that I mentioned. Penultimate slide. Without long-term volunteers who repeatedly enact this intense community practice, this sponsorship year after year, the private refugee sponsorship program would not exist. And while Canada is working to help other countries replicate this kind of program, we have to focus on the minutiae, on the culture of sponsorship, if you like, in order to get it right and not to lose track of what's in the water, what keeps people going. While sponsorship is a formal program, it is a 4-decade-year-old routine commitment that has been made. A community practice, as I've said, that's conducted at an intensely local level, but also motivated through transnational linkages with family members, ethno-national communities, connecting across borders and identifying subsequent people. Now, I want to make it very clear that private sponsorship occurs with people whom sponsors have never met, and they may choose from a list of visa office referred families or individuals, but they may also choose to support someone they've already brought in by sponsoring a family member now known to their people in their own community who've been brought into that community. Why do people do it? It's a pledge to put into practice, to do something, as it were, and to enact locally this global sense of social justice. We heard the word responsibility, we heard the word human rights, we heard it's the right thing to do. It's a renewed effort on the part of former refugees who come to live in Canada to pay forward their own protection to help family members or co-nationals. So while there are no guarantees that they'll be able to bring those family members or co-nationals in, those connections to the conflict zones where people were displaced in the first place, to those refugee camps where people, almost 30 million people remain refugees in the world today, and 2/3 of them are in protracted situations. So there are people who are just waiting. And this program is not going to make a dent in that group of people that are waiting in any huge way. But where it does make a dent is, one person, one family at a time, meaningful protection is provided. Will civil society keep stepping up? I think so. However, there is, in this third sort of phase of governance, the reasserting sovereignty piece that I brought up at the outset, people are grumpy, sponsors are grumpy because they're now expected to spend 10 to 20% of their time reporting back on what they've done. and recording, taking photos of the checks that they've given to the families that they've sponsored, and paperwork, which is already fairly onerous when you look at the application form for privately sponsored refugees. So there is frustration. There is a bit of a sense of pushback, but there is also a sense of continued urgency. There are families who would love to be reunited with refugees who remain in camps and other settlements. And so I think there's a good chance that this will continue for some time to come. I certainly hope so. So thanks, everyone. Questions, comments, there's an email address there if you wish to be in touch. Let me finish with Salam's word. She was a key informant. She said, as long as the refugee crisis does not go away, the need to help someone will not go away. We have humanity, so there are always people who would respond to the refugee crisis. So hopefully a bit of a note of hope on for what those of us in the Northern Hemisphere is almost the darkest day of the year. And we all have a bit of COVID to deal with too. So thanks so much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for this very interesting talk in terms of actually with so many examples, but also it brought in the scales very vividly into the picture, and it opens, I think, several of those questions, and I'm sure we have already some questions, but I would just like to underline a couple of issues that I thought that they were very, very important in terms of, one, the question about the portability of the policies, that the policies on the move. That's the question that I think I found it very important, that one size fits all, and that's especially with the compacts. And I mean rightly so, that you brought up that as a kind of a good practice. So let's move all those policies, and what made the sponsorship? What were the particularities of that sponsorship, and what kind of actors in various different scales of actors needed to be involved. And I thought that this was very important, and to see also the kind of the different registers of hierarchies involved in the sponsorship, that within the bureaucracy of it, where while it looks very open, and that in that sense I think it is very important. I have a couple of questions that maybe some others will also join that. One of them was that you touched upon a little bit, but did not expand very much, in terms of how the financialization of that sponsorship. And we have seen that in the kind of the different phases that we saw that, but this private sponsorship, where do you see that the kind of the financialization get into the picture? That I could imagine several, but it would be interesting to learn about that. And then the kind of the tension between, is there a tension between private sponsorship and asylum, that the private sponsorship might enable or work against? I don't know. How do they kind of interact in terms of the governance, also governance structures? And and also one question is about the voluntarization, and that we have seen in Europe also this kind of, with the welcoming of the refugees, very much with the voluntarization. And there it seems that it has also a dark side of this kind of voluntarization, in terms of relieving the state from the from that kind of the responsibilities. And my last point, I mean, you don't have to respond to all those, but I found it also very interesting in terms of the responses. Why do they sponsor? And that in global justice and then kind of the inequalities and global responsibilities, how do you think that, what kind of there is a kind of a canonization of, I mean, you put it as the categories, but you could also see that as partly a kind of a canonizations of the responses. How mediated you think those responses are? And transnational networks of those, especially those faith-based communities or ethno-religious communities, that if they have, you emphasize their transnational linkages, but you could look at them as transnational formations. How do they figure out as political actors in those in Canada or in some other places that they are connected? So these are the kind of the questions I thought that were very, very interesting to, they were very intriguing. So if you would like to respond just to one or two of them, then we might take also some other questions.
Actually, thank you. Those are great questions, and I will let me just try to respond genuinely with some gravitas or detail to them, because I think they're important. I might not get to all of them, but I think it's the very practical point about the financialization.
Yeah.
If you can't afford to be a sponsor, if you don't have 5,000 euros to put on the table, you might not be able to be a sponsor. So there is a barrier, and it becomes some have argued, a kind of middle class luxury. The one good thing about the BVOR category, again, BVOR, is it's a 50-50 financialization. The government pays half and the sponsors pay half. So it reduces the amount of money that is required. And in the past year and a half, 2 years, we've actually had foundations put in the 50% required by the sponsor, so that there is no income requirement. But having said that, the amount is on parity in Canada with basically the social welfare stipend you would receive if you were a citizen and you had no job and no income. And let's just say that is a very low bar. Statistics Canada has low income cutoffs, which are about here, and then our social assistance rates are quite significantly below that. So we're talking for a family of 4 to sponsor them to come, you would be looking probably at about 20,000 euros, maybe a little bit more, 32,000 Canadian dollars, maybe 24,000 euros. I'm doing the math in my head, which is not a good idea. So that is split among 5 people. So each person would be up for, say, 5,000 euros for a family of 4. Something like that. Now, let me say that is not the actual cost of sponsoring them. Every sponsor that you speak to will speak about covering additional costs, about buying a bike for the kids for their holiday present or something like that. So there are lots of additional, I would say, costs, top-ups. Yeah, so that's one. The tension between private sponsorship and asylum, I'm going to set that one aside. I think we all know that resettlement and asylum are always in a constant tension, and we see this in Canada. Canada has what I've called cold water geography. On 3 ocean sides, we are protected, and so therefore we don't get many asylum seekers until they start walking across the border when Trump bans certain nationalities in 2017. So that was, a big wake-up call to Canada, and it's been a real struggle for the country to kind of figure out what to do. But I do think we cannot ever allow resettlement and resettled refugees to be pitted against or become a reason for not accepting asylum seekers or for blocking them, which Canada, I have to say, does a pretty good job of sealing its border. Our visa, our biometric visa regime and our airline liaison officers seal us off from a lot of would-be asylum seekers. So we're not good in that respect. I think your point about the voluntarism and the dark side, I'm not sure if I'm reading this question right, but the power differentials are enormous between many of the sponsors and those who are sponsored. Winona Giles and I have actually, critiqued what we call the rescue narrative. And I think what's quite impressive is when if you read some of the handbooks that sponsors put out for new sponsors that are coming on board, one of the first things they talk about are these power differentials and the autonomy of the people that are being sponsored and their, right to make decisions about their lives. Not only their right, I mean, you have to start, your starting point has to be that, in my view, resettlement is not a solution, as the UNHCR would put it, but is a strategy. And it is the best decision for a person or a family at that time. It's a decision made by the person coming here, by the sponsored refugee, not by the sponsors. Ultimately, leaving home is never taken lightly. And so if you see resettlement as a strategy, it's not an endpoint. It might be after 10 years when your kids have got out of high school and they're settled and everyone is in a good place. You might go back to the country of refuge that you were in and lived in for 10 years before that. Or you may be able to go home if somehow the conflict has changed. So I think we should revise our understanding of resettlement as strategy, not as solution. And those power differentials are fraught. And I think the best way to deal with them is head on. And it's a great starting point for sponsors when they're coming on board. I'm not sure what to say about the canonization question. So maybe if you could posit it in another way, how it's mediated. I wasn't 100% clear on that question, but I'd be happy to deal and address any of those. The one about transnationalization of political actors. Again, those are very big, and if there's a way I could tackle that with a bit more specificity, I'm not quite sure how to do it. But thank you for amazing questions.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I don't want to monopolize because we have a lot of questions. Of course, the voluntarism is there are power differentials, but then the more voluntarism, the less that the governments feel responsibilities, and then gets into the financialization aspect of it. That is what I was hinting at. And then in terms of the, I know from my own research, some of the faith-based organizations that definitely they would not be the champions of the human rights when it comes to certain issues, but this would always be the kind of the response that, because there is a kind of an acceptance of that legitimacy of as that kind of explanation. But I do not want to monopolize. We have very interesting questions. One question we have is that, did your research sample include LGBTQ plus sponsorship? And especially, this is also what I was also getting at in terms of the faith-based communities, not necessarily the best groups that are being very open to different choices, different lives. And so did your research sample really include LGBTQ? And what was the percentage of the sample?
That's a great question. In principle, we sought out all groups. And I have to say that it's quite a challenge to find people who were formerly sponsored, who've been in Canada 5, preferably 10 years. And so we looked, as far as we could. And to be honest, I don't know that we have anyone in our sample that's LGBTQ, two-spirited. However, having said that, this is something that I consider hugely important. We know that I see Sherilyn's name mentioned here. So Ranjit, thank you for the question. Sherilyn Jordan and others in Vancouver have been part of the Rainbow Refugee Committee, and a government program to focus specifically on LGBTQ groups. We know that the UNHCR has identified queer folk as targeted group and therefore a vulnerable group. And I have interviewed SAS, so sponsorship agreement holder staff, who we spoke at length, so about connections that are quite exciting. So imagine a faith group, a church group, being involved in being approached by a community group somewhere in the prairies, we won't say where, and the church is able to be the sponsorship agreement holder, is able to be the umbrella organization. The community group is able to form a constituent group under the master agreement, the SA, and working together have been able to bring to Canada, to the prairies, to not a very big city in the prairies, you know, a good number and an increasing kind of flow of LGBTQ2SI refugees. So this is, of course, an important group that needs to not fall off the table or radar, and is certainly on UNHCR's radar. But we know there's the underground, not underground, it's called the Refugee Railway, another private sponsorship group in Toronto, specifically focuses on a lot of refugees coming out of Iran, where of course the death penalty is the threat for queer people there, and so hugely important issue. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have another question regarding Aisha's case. Can she not legally, through family reunification, sponsor her parents? And meaning she could use the laws and does not need to rely on private sponsorship. Why couldn't she do this through family reunification and needed the sponsorship? And then I'm gonna, for time purposes, I'm gonna collect a couple of, and the other one is that Howard Edelman, politicians follow, they do not lead. This was not the case with Indo-Chinese refugees. And then Gordon Hamilton, why can you not sponsor someone from their home country? My understanding is that the persons must be residing outside of their country before they can be accepted. So not directly. And then Bernadette Ludwig, can you also speak about the white savior syndrome, if this came up at all?
Okay, I'm going to ask you, Aisha, for the second last question one more time, but let me just quickly try to address some of those. The white savior piece, I tried to, when I mentioned the rescue narrative, there were very few cases actually where people felt they were saving. There were sponsors who used the word save, as you saw in the presentation. But you know, it's a valid criticism where it happens, but I would say on the whole, sponsors very savvy, very aware of power differentials, working very hard to respect autonomy, and yet, you know, political situations would always emerge for sure. To Howard's point, absolutely. Remember, that was Tony saying that, not me. But it was in our data set. So we brought it up, and that was in a fairly rural community that that Tony said that. So I think it's an interesting observation. I mean, Howard, you were involved yourself at the very beginning in basically the initial voyage of people coming from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. And in fact, the politicians truly did step up at that moment. And I think to Naomi Alboim's point, political leadership is vital, in my view. And that's why I put Naomi's point there. But certainly civil society often needs a nudge. And politicians can be those leaders that are, of course, democratically elected. The family reunification point with Aisha is a very good one. In theory, yes, her family could sponsor her parents, but the income requirement in order for those family members not to be dependent is at least $85,000, from my understanding of it. Aisha, I should mention, was in the process of putting her 3 adult daughters through university. One had a master's degree, another one was on the way to that master's degree. There wasn't that kind of money to be able to put aside and go through the immigration family reunification category. Hence, private sponsorship was an option, but again, difficult also to sponsor people who are still inside Iraq, because until they leave, it's hard to prove that they had to leave and that they would qualify as refugees. So that's, Canada used to have what was called a source country class of refugees, but we unfortunately got rid of that some time ago. All right, so let's see, did I get the majority of those questions?
Yes,
Maybe
you did. And in terms of, but I think you answered that from their home country. Bushra Bozkurt, does refugee definition include climate-induced migrants for resettlement to Canada? So that is the climate refugees or displaced. That does it include? I think this is also a very important.
No, it's a really interesting question. The short answer is no. UNHCR's definition is one that's used to select the BVORs and the government-assisted refugees. Private sponsorship has a slightly more discretionary bar. The Canadian government can use prima facie group refugee status and has done so in the Syrian case. But it's a very important question about who is left out of refugee resettlement. And, you know, the word refugee itself is in many ways, you know, insufficient. There are many migrants on the move who might be fleeing famine, which is basically climate change and, you know, related drought, plus, you know, politics, creating a situation that makes it impossible for people to eat, and then they have to leave. But they may not be seen to meet the refugee definition. So we have people on the move under conditions not of their own making that need protection. And many of our categories are insufficient. So it's a very important point that you make.
Okay, thank you. I will just again put 3 together and you choose. I mean, you respond because of time altogether. Bahati and Nistina. Wonderful presentation, Professor Hyndman. I'm a refugee academic in Nairobi. My question is, how can institutions support refugee participation in generation of such evidence-based data that inform as well as influence action in the right direction policy-wise? Can refugees access scholarships, publication opportunities, employment? This is one. And the other one is Howard Edelman. Again, did you do research on the shifts in guarantees from 1979 to 2020, and in terms of shifting cash upfront, greater bureaucracy, and money commitment? And this is also partly related, that kind of the question that I was asking for this financialization. And then from Johannes, are there any such programs in Europe to your knowledge? I know one in Germany, NEST, New Starting Team. I would like to know if there's interest to transfer this kind of program in European countries.
Okay, thank you. All great questions. Let me start with Johannes's question. You know, in the Netherlands, there's some effort to work towards resettlement. And the name of the group is escaping me at this exact moment, but I'd be happy to follow up, Johannes, if you want me to. I had the good fortune of meeting them and giving a brief talk in October. And Germany, of course, has been doing some resettlement, often at municipal kind of levels. So to be honest, I need to do a bit more research, but there has been some excellent research out of MPI in the US, which has done a sort of looked at humanitarian corridors in Italy, and looked at whether those are comparable with resettlement schemes as we know them in, say, the North American context. So great question, Howard. Really good points. I am not looking in great detail at the shifts in the guarantees, except that the assurance kind of audit culture and the greater bureaucracy that you speak of is certainly one of the reasons that sponsors have a more bitter taste in their mouth at the moment. The money commitment is not hugely different, but there were strategies that sponsors could use. So for example, sponsors get a family up and running and independent and employed within 6 months. They have 6 months of money left. They could use that to work on a subsequent sponsorship. Now there's auditing going on that requires that sponsorship group to provide that stipend for the whole 12 months, regardless of whether they're self-sufficient and earning their money. So there's, and pictures of checks and all of this kind of proof that you are doing due diligence. There's reason to ensure that people are getting the minimum standard of support that is agreed upon, because as it turns out, through in the Operation Syria moment, or the Syrian initiative, I should call it, in Canada, there were refugee families that didn't get the stipend that they needed and had to, reach out and say, hey, I don't have any food money, I don't know what to do. So there are a few cases that have, I think, probably tripped the wire for the vast majority of sponsors. And I think the people who are feeling it most are those who've been sponsoring, since 1985, who can't understand why now they have to spend 2 hours per week on reporting requirements that weren't there before. They don't feel that they feel the trust has been broken or lost. I think that's what I've heard during the many interviews. Getting back to Nairobi, it's wonderful to have you on the lines. Refugee participation is so vital. I mean, it goes without saying that the reframing of refugee resettlement as strategy rather than solution is vital to understanding that it's a strategy taken by the person whose security is questioned and who's in a precarious situation. In Canada and across the world, nothing about us without us is that refrain that we've heard in terms of refugee-led initiatives. And ultimately in Canada, Canada's participation abroad has tried to bring in, and we actually had someone who came to Canada as a refugee, participating in the XCOM meetings, not this year, but a year ago, when people still went to meetings and met with each other. So sitting right beside our Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. So that was symbolic, but it needs to go far beyond symbolic. And I agree with you. Refugee access, employment, these are important issues. At my school here at York University, Winona Giles and others and Don Dippo, basically professors have been working now for about 5 or 6 years to ensure that there are opportunities for university education in places like the Dadaab camps, where there's after you finish secondary education, there's really nothing much to do. And these are portable skills. Not everyone needs to or should go to university, but for those who can access some training and get a degree that's hopefully portable. UBC's been involved in this as well. Kenyatta University, Moi University in Nairobi. So all to say that it's important. I would point you to the Refugee Research Network, the RRN, because that's an effort to put online as much as possible academic pieces, gray literature, but I think we all have to work as academics harder and harder to ensure open access for the work that we do so that it's not stuck behind paywalls. So I think those are the main questions that were posed. Thank you.
I think I would just take a couple of, but there are also this education program anchored at Princeton, I think, with the Jeremy Edelman, in terms of decoloring, especially the camps. So there are a couple of, and then the textbooks produced for that. And also we had, now in Vienna based Olive. Actually, Olive is in Berlin based now, had to had to be displaced because of Hungary and Orban from CEU. There are some kinds of initiatives also for that and in Europe. And I think it is also very important, this the participatory part which came out from your talk also, that these the sponsorships actually facilitate a very different kind of sociability between the people sponsored and the incoming and then the sponsors, so within the society. So not only simply the simple social capital, but really much broader. We have one question from Aziz Rahman. How is the future refugee resettlement may meet international obligations in terms of numbers, and also how the economic integration of privately sponsored refugees and GARs will look like in the near future? This is one. And in relation to those geographical spread and preferences that you noted where in relation to the PSRs, are they also present in the GARs? I mean, partly you touched it, but then maybe extend a little bit. And which came out very strongly, and then in this Tihomir Subchev's question, related to the PSRs and the GARs, this private sponsorship is inherently, as you show, a local practice. I wonder if you think their local governments can get a larger role in such initiatives in the future, that especially also in relation to the response that you give with the municipalities and that kind of the aspect. And then from Hassan Boubakri, for the former refugees, asylum seekers, is the sponsorship system made in order to make them able to sponsor not their own new national or ethnic community members, but other refugees coming from other ethnic or national communities? Do you see that kind of a dynamic? I think these are right now the, I mean, I know that you're also tired, but these are actually very good questions, I think.
Very good. And the only one I didn't fully grasp is the very first one with Aziz on resettlement. Could you just repeat that one, Aisha, and then I'll take a go at the other four.
It is, Aziz Rahman says that, as I understand from your talk, PSR program has been increasing exponentially, compromising the additional principle in Canada. How is the future refugee resettlement may meet international obligations in terms of numbers? And also how the economic integration of PSRs and GARs will look like in the near future. Actually, I think that this is the tension between the international obligations and the private sponsors.
Right, right. Whew, that's a big one. So as he's starting with your question, then the notion of additionality is not happening. So Howard would know well that when this arrangement was set up in the first instance back in the late 1970s, the idea was the government sponsors one and then civil society sponsors another. So right now, I think that the reason we're seeing the sponsorship numbers go up and the private sponsorship numbers go up and the government-assisted refugee numbers not go up as much, obviously it's more costly to the government, but there is, from the Syrian moment, I would say there has been a kind of enthusiasm and stepping up that is, again, much like the late 1970s, early 80s, sort of this surge of sponsor interest. So I think the government is trying to capture that and not, restrict it in any way. And one way to do that, and one way to do it without putting too much money in the kitty from the government's point of view, is to increase the private sponsorship. But it does violate that additionality principle. And I think that's going to be allowable for sponsors as long as they get to have some autonomy on who they sponsor. Now, many sponsors don't need to know who they're going to sponsor, and they'll sponsor whoever's on the list, so to speak. But their autonomy needs to be respected. Where I see sponsors pushing back is against the B4 category, because the blended visa office referred refugees are from the UNHCR referral list. So that is to say they can't be named. So that is where sponsors say, okay, if you want us to put our own money in, we want some say on who we're going to sponsor. The B4 category takes that power away from us. And I think that we're seeing some pushback there. What about the economic integration of PSRs and GARs? There are some good studies out there that we can point to about this. I think in a way the two groups are incomparable. They're selected differently. We need both. In fact, we need all pathways to protection for people who are refugees, which is to say government-assisted refugees tend to meet certain vulnerability criteria set out by UNHCR that might relate to serious medical problems, having disabilities, having serious threats against them because of sexuality or gender identity, being a lone parent of a large family. All of these can qualify someone as vulnerable. Can you expect that, family in need of protection to be employed as quickly and readily ever as the group of people who were software engineers in Iran before they arrived? No, of course not. So I think the comparison is a flawed one, but that's my opinion. I do think we can look at the numbers and we can see that PSRs tend to get jobs first. Their incidence of employment is higher in year one, but then GARs are given, 1 year of income, not social assistance, as a stipend, and they're told, get English, get French, work on your official language skills so that you're going to get a good job. And as it turns out, after 10 years, both groups tend to even out in terms of employment records. That's a bit of a generalization, but it's also fairly, the data support it. Okay, so sponsorship, PSRs versus GARs, the geography of it, definitely the government-assisted refugees go to fewer locations. Michaela Hinia, a professor also at York, has done a lot of work on the government-assisted refugees, who generally go to between 23 and 30 cities across Canada. These are medium-sized and large cities that tend to have, as a matter of course, they have to provide settlement support services. They tend to have specialized services. The larger cities, of course, would have things like services for survivors of torture, for example, but also serious medical and complicated medical conditions will require you to be in a bigger city just because you'll need specialists who can help you out. So PSRs, in theory, can be most widely distributed as they were in the Syrian moment. But we find in the data set, in recent Statistics Canada data, that in fact it's the GARs, the government-assisted refugees, who are more likely to take on secondary migration and move somewhere else from a smaller city, medium-sized city, to a bigger one, perhaps for employment, perhaps for other reasons. We don't actually know. We have to ask them. Local government involvement is such an important point. Shauna Labman has a new book, 2019, which is really worth reading. And in it, she talks about the city of Winnipeg wanting to increase its population and setting aside a serious pot of money, I think it was $200,000, which may not seem even like that much money, but for the city to embark on sponsorships, for them to support sponsorships to literally grow the city with, newcomers who come from refugee backgrounds and who will make, great residents. And that's one of those prairie cities that has a very, very large, not large, but per capita does a lot of sponsorship and does a lot of government-assisted refugee resettlement. Okay, sponsorship of other groups, not just family. Yes, that's my shorthand for the question about, do we see people sponsoring people that are not just their families? Absolutely. We see people sponsoring people they've never met, but whose whose very existence seems to be on the line. And I'm thinking of an interview in London, Ontario, with a person who says, you know, this is to do with an ethno-national community, but it's to do with a conflict zone where people's human rights and, you know, war crimes are occurring. And, you know, people don't know the individuals that they might be sponsoring, but they know that they're in a very tight spot and they need to get out. So what we're hearing, however, is that sponsors are stretched. One sponsor talks about taking out a second mortgage in order to afford sponsorship. And how this is affecting the next generation, which is to say the youth. So yes, people are doing that. There's far more demand for sponsorship than there are places. And this is the very humbling, you know, on the one hand, it's motivating. On the other hand, it's a very, it's a very tricky situation because there are far more people who need and want sponsorship than there are sponsors and spaces for them. So I hope I've done justice to all those questions. They're really good ones, and I'm happy to.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. They were great answers, especially in terms of the distribution through the SARS and then the GARs, and then where they settled, the secondary migration. I think these are also very important aspects of the for those settlement mechanisms. And of course, this mortgage that you referred to, taking the mortgage, this is what I was also referring to, this kind of financialization, because this is how that certain financial services get into the picture. And there was one question that you could just say yes or no. That's why I will just take that question, and then we will finish. Someone is asking, is there a tax break for sponsors?
That's a great question. So when the Syrians came, there were a few initiatives that I'm trying to remember, that there was a way to donate towards, I think towards one particular community sponsor, and that there was a possibility of a tax receipt. However, and I think that's true. You could probably donate to a church and you say, please allocate this to the refugee fund. There are ways to get a tax receipt. I would say, however, and I am pretty sure the people who sponsor and have to put their 5,000 euros down are not allowed to write off those 5,000 euros. Like that is an after-tax dollar that, and I may be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's not the case. I know I've donated to a community sponsorship group and been given a tax receipt, but I also know that I've donated to another SAW and not had a tax receipt. So I think it depends, but SAWs are registered charities, which is just a term. Charity is a problematic term, as we know, but in Canada that gives you a certain tax status. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. This was really very, very interesting. And the questions that you're in responding to questions, you have expanded and you have actually put a broader terrain for research for all of us. And thank you very much. And I hope that we will be able to continue these conversations. And I hope that there would be some kinds of similar kinds of schemes, although we know the travel policies do not travel that perfectly and that well, but in Europe more and more, because what you had given at the beginning is that some kind of conditions is that also media support and that kind of a general support, and unfortunately we are having a very antagonistic discursive field and media and mobilizations for and against in Europe, and then how the places and states see themselves vis-a-vis as migration, of course, is a little bit more complicated here, complicating the situation for the refugee settlement. Thank you very much, and I thank you very much for all the participants and with your great questions, and please excuse us if we were not able to take all of your questions, because then we would have abused our time and abused actually Jennifer's time and endurance. So hopefully we will be able to see you in January with Pram Kumar Rajaram, that who will be talking in January and 20th of January. And thank you very much once more, Jennifer, and thanks to Anna and Clemens again. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for inviting me. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye. Thanks, Jennifer.
Take care.